So picture this scenario for a second. You're at a really crowded party. Maybe it's like a massive networking event in the city.
Oh, yeah, the worst kind of party.
Right, exactly. And you are quite literally shoulder to shoulder with, I don't know, hundreds of people. The room is super loud, the conversations are flowing, drinks are clinking.
Total sensory overload.
Yeah. And yet, standing right there in the absolute epicenter of this human gathering, you feel this overwhelming, basically suffocating sense of total isolation.
It's a very weird feeling.
It's a bizarre paradox, honestly. And it's one that you, the listener, have almost certainly experienced at some point, because we are a species that is biologically and psychologically wired for fellowship.
Right, completely hardwired for it.
But despite that, we are constantly haunted by this profound, inescapable loneliness. And, I mean, it doesn't stop there either.
No, it really doesn't.
Like, our default setting in times of crisis isn't actually to draw closer together. It's to hide or to cast blame, to rationalize our mistakes, or, we just endlessly doom scroll or seek out these distractions just to numb the void.
Yeah, and we treat this phenomenon like it's like a modern bug in the human operating system.
Like it's a new issue.
Exactly. We assume it's just a byproduct of the digital age or late-stage capitalism or maybe the breakdown of the nuclear family.
We look at the fragmentation in our communities and we just instinctively grab a sociological toolkit, right? Or a psychological one.
Right. We prescribe better communication frameworks or more empathy training or structural societal reforms, which, they have their place.
Which, to be fair, yeah, they are useful tools, but honestly, they feel like we are treating a symptom while just totally ignoring a massive underlying disease.
That is a very accurate way to put it.
And that's really what brings us to today's deep dive. We are looking at this absolutely massive, comprehensive framework developed by Chris R. Velazquez.
It's an incredibly dense piece of work.
It really is. It's a collection of theological essays, and it's accompanied by these, incredibly intricate visual maps and infographics. And Velazquez makes a deeply provocative claim right out of the gate.
He really pulls no punches.
No, he doesn't. He argues that this foundational human loneliness is not a psychological glitch. It is not a social failure. It is fundamentally a metaphysical and theological symptom.
Right. According to these texts, humanity is suffering from a massive, multidimensional dislocation.
We haven't just, drifted from a moral ideal. We have actively severed ourselves from the actual source of life itself.
Yeah, the premise Velazquez lays out is that spiritual alienation is the root condition of the human experience. He treats it like the dark matter of human history.
I love that analogy, dark matter.
Right, because you can't always see it directly, but its gravitational pull affects the trajectory of literally everything else.
Yeah.
So when his framework speaks of separation from God, it's not talking about a polite disagreement on theological principles.
It's not just a difference of opinion.
Exactly. It is describing a catastrophic, literal fracture in the architecture of reality. And this fracture, according to his essays, darkens human cognition. It corrupts our will. It disorders what we desire.
And just leaves us completely, totally alienated.
Precisely.
So I want to spend the next hour really tearing into the anatomy of that loneliness.
Yeah.
We're going to trace the epic arc of the biblical narrative exactly as it's mapped out in Velazquez's infographics.
It's quite the journey.
It is. But I don't want to just recount the sanitized Sunday school version of events. I really want to look at the actual mechanics of this framework.
The nuts and bolts.
Yes, exactly. Like, how does guilt generate pollution? Why does a holy presence act as a destructive force to an alienated person?
And how does that map onto real life?
Right. How does this historical theology map onto your Tuesday morning staff meeting or, that argument you keep having with your spouse?
It's highly practical once you get into it.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand the sheer scale of the rupture, we have to start by analyzing the baseline data. What was the original connection actually engineered to look like?
Well, if we look at the first infographic in the Velazquez material, it's labeled The Blueprint of Communion. It maps out Genesis 1 and 2.
Okay.
And it treats it not as a quaint origin myth, but as a literal architectural schematic for human flourishing. The baseline here is profound intimacy.
Right.
The text emphasizes that humanity was created in the image of God. But Velazquez pushes way past the common interpretation of that phrase.
Which is usually just that we, like, resemble God somehow.
Right. The typical idea of the Imago Dei is just about humans having rationality or conscience, like a mirror just reflecting divine attributes.
Yeah.
But Velazquez says it designates a specific functional capacity. It is an ontological vocation.
Okay, let me pause you there. When you say ontological vocation, that sounds like a job description that's literally built into our DNA.
That's exactly what it is.
But how does that actually differ from the standard definition that we just, look somewhat like God in our capacity to reason?
Because a mirror is passive. Right. A vocation is active.
Oh, I see.
To be made in the image of God, specifically in the ancient Near Eastern context that Genesis operates in, is to be placed as a representative ruler and a relational counterpart.
Wow.
We were engineered to possess this incredible relational bandwidth. And that bandwidth was specifically calibrated to interface with the infinite creator.
So it's not just a nice feature, it's the core function.
Exactly. We were made to relate, to govern, and to derive our entire sense of identity from that totally unhindered connection.
And when you read the Genesis 2 narrative through that lens, the garden isn't just some nice little biosphere.
No, not at all.
The text explicitly states that God walked with humanity.
Yeah.
There's this active, dynamic interface happening. Human consciousness was basically completely saturated by divine nearness.
There's static on the line.
Right. No static, no latency in the connection. But Velazquez uses a specific term to describe this environment that I think actually trips a lot of people up. He calls this fellowship covenantal.
He does, yeah. And the visual map spent a lot of real estate unpacking that specific word.
Because it's crucial.
It is. A covenant is the structural framework of this intimacy. It is an ordered relationship, and it's governed by trust, obedience, and total dependence.
I have a bit of a problem with how that word is usually deployed in our culture, though.
How so?
Well, when modern ears hear covenant, they just hear contract. They think of, like, a lease agreement.
Oh, sure, like a transaction.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, you prune the bushes in the garden, you don't eat the apple, and I'll let you live here rent-free. It sounds highly transactional. And if God is entirely self-sufficient, why does he need to establish this legalistic framework with humans in the first place?
Well, because it isn't a legalistic framework. It's a structural necessity for finite creatures interacting with an infinite being.
Okay, break that down.
Velazquez's maps clarify this distinction brilliantly. A contract is fundamentally about protecting self-interest and limiting your liability.
Right, like buying a car.
Exactly. If you buy a car, the contract ensures you get the car, the dealer gets the money. If either party fails to deliver, the contract is voided and you just walk away.
You sever ties.
But a covenant is entirely different. A covenant is about self-giving. It's the binding of two parties into a single reality. It's completely organic.
I was thinking about this, and tell me if this tracks. Think of it like the difference between an API call between two different software programs and the foundational operating system itself.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so a contract is just an API call. It requests specific data, it gets a result, and then it closes the connection.
Right, it's isolated.
But a covenant is the operating system. It is the very environment in which all the programs have to run in order to exist at all.
That's a highly accurate way to frame it, yes. The covenant in Eden was defined by this life-giving trust. The human operating system was designed to run exclusively on the power source of the Creator's presence.
Okay, that makes sense.
And we see the parameters of this system in Genesis 2, specifically with the prohibition regarding the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Right, the famous tree.
Yeah.
The kill switch in the garden.
Yes, the tree.
And this is exactly where the skeptical mind immediately flags an issue.
Well,
Why put the tree there at all? It just seems like a completely arbitrary trap.
it's a very common question.
Because if the environment is perfectly calibrated for human flourishing, why introduce this one variable that could literally crash the entire system?
The source material actually addresses this head-on. The tree wasn't a petty test of willpower, It wasn't an arbitrary tripwire.
Yeah, what was it?
It was a physical, topographical reminder of a fundamental reality. Humans are creatures, not the creator. They are finite.
It's a boundary condition.
To use your terminology. Yes, it functions as a boundary condition. It establishes that human beings are designed to flourish specifically through dependence on God's definition of reality.
Instead of defining it themselves.
Right. Rather than seizing complete autonomy to define good and evil for themselves, the boundary wasn't keeping them from freedom.
Oh, wow.
The boundary was the very thing preserving their life. It's much like how the hull of a submarine protects the sailors from the crushing pressure of the ocean.
Velazquez includes an analogy in his essays that I think perfectly captures this, and I really want you, the listener, to visualize the actual mechanics of this. He writes, "Fish do not merely prefer water. They are made for it."
Such a great line.
It is. Now, let's look at the biology of that. A fish isn't just an animal that happens to enjoy swimming on the weekends, right? Its entire respiratory system, its gills, they're engineered to extract dissolved oxygen from water.
They physically need it.
Right. Its cardiovascular system requires the specific atmospheric pressure of a fluid environment just to function.
So when you pull a fish out of the water, you aren't just depriving it of a luxury. You're not taking away its favorite toy.
No, obviously not.
You are removing it from the literal, only physical environment where its biology is capable of sustaining life.
Right. It's suffocating. It is taking in air, yes, but its gills cannot process atmospheric oxygen. It is violently extracted from its proper domain.
And according to Velazquez's framework, that is the exact ontological state of humanity today.
We are out of the water.
Exactly. Humanity was engineered for the presence of God, so separation from God isn't losing a perk or failing to live up to some moral standard.
It is being violently extracted from the very metaphysical atmosphere we were designed to breathe.
Yes, we are literally the fish gasping on the dock.
Flapping around, wondering why everything hurts, trying to process an environment of autonomy that our spiritual gills just aren't designed to handle.
Which perfectly diagnoses the universal restlessness we discussed earlier.
At the party.
Right. The isolation you feel in that crowded room is literally the sensation of your spiritual gills drying out. But the pressing question the framework moves to next is,
if the water was so perfectly calibrated and the fish was designed for it, why on earth did humanity jump out of the fishbowl?
exactly. And that brings us to Genesis 3, the historical rupture that the sources call the fall.
I want to look closely at the mechanics of the temptation here, because honestly, it's much more sophisticated than just a talking snake offering Eve a shiny piece of fruit.
Oh, completely. The core of the serpent's argument wasn't about the physical properties of the fruit at all.
Like, oh, this is high in vitamin C.
Right, no, it was a highly targeted attack on the nature of the covenant itself.
Yeah.
The serpent essentially says, did God really say that? You won't die. In fact, if you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.
It's a massive epistemological shift. The serpent is basically inviting humanity to move from revelation, meaning trusting God's definition of reality, to radical empiricism.
Test it yourself.
Exactly. Don't trust the Creator. Test it yourself. Define good and evil on your own terms. It's an invitation to seize moral self-determination, to be the captain of your own ship.
And Velazquez's maps detail how this single calculated grab for autonomy didn't just, break a rule.
It wasn't a minor infraction.
No, it caused an immediate, catastrophic systemic failure. The framework visualizes this rupture-fracturing reality in 4 very distinct simultaneous dimensions.
Let's trace those 4 dimensions, because as I was reading this, it maps perfectly onto modern psychology and sociology.
It really does. So the first dimension is inward separation.
Okay.
The text points out that innocence is instantly obliterated. For the very first time in human consciousness, shame and fear are generated.
Which didn't exist before.
Right. Prior to this, Genesis notes they were naked and unashamed. There was total transparency. But the moment autonomy is seized, what happens? They are frantically gathering fig leaves to cover themselves.
The internal architecture of the human mind just fractures. The internal monologue shifts from perfect peace to profound paranoia. You immediately become a threat to yourself.
Exactly.
Then the second dimension, relational separation. God walks into the garden, asks Adam what happened, and what is the very first thing Adam does?
He throws Eve under the bus.
Immediately. The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit.
He blames his wife, and in the exact same breath implies it is basically God's fault for creating her in the first place.
The covenantal unity of us instantly devolves into a defensive, self-protecting me versus you.
Yes. The foundation for every single war, every divorce, and every societal conflict is laid in that single defensive maneuver.
That's terrifying. Then we hit the third dimension, which Velazquez views as the true epicenter of the catastrophe.
Spiritual separation from God's presence.
Right.
The visual map here is really striking. Genesis 3 describes them actively hiding from the Lord among the trees.
Think about that. The fundamental human instinct, which was previously to draw near to the Creator, is completely inverted.
It is replaced by a desperate, instinctual urge to conceal themselves.
The unhindered presence of God is suddenly perceived as a lethal threat.
And that leads right into the fourth dimension, which finalizes the rupture. Environmental separation.
The physical world.
Right. They are separated from the garden itself. Exile and judgment are pronounced. They are driven out into the wilderness, and cherubim are stationed to guard the way back to the tree of life.
So the physical environment is now subjected to decay and futility, and humanity's placement within the ecosystem is suddenly antagonistic rather than harmonious.
Inward, relational, vertical, and environmental. A total four-dimensional collapse of the operating system.
Wow.
And Velasquez notes that this specific movement from communion to concealment, from placement to exile, that becomes the defining fractal pattern for the rest of the biblical narrative.
I want to push back on how we use the word sin here, though, because, I mean, if you ask 100 people in the street today what sin is, 99 of them will define it purely behaviorally.
They'll say it's doing a bad thing.
Right, like cheating on your taxes or running a red light. The law is this external code. I violated it, I pay a fine, and my internal state remains completely unchanged.
A traffic ticket.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what this framework is describing sounds biological. It sounds like a terminal disease.
What's fascinating here is that the framework explicitly wars against the behavioral reductionism of our modern culture.
Oh, good.
Yeah, the essays argue forcefully that sin does not merely violate an external law, it fundamentally dislocates the soul.
Dislocates the soul.
Yes. Velasquez uses a specific matrix to break down the anatomy of this condition into four interconnected aspects. He labels them: guilt, pollution, bondage, and alienation.
Let's unpack the mechanics of those four, because honestly, this changes how we view human dysfunction entirely. Let's start with guilt.
Okay, so guilt, in this specific theological framework, is not an emotion.
It's not feeling bad about something.
No. It is an objective legal standing. It is the judicial reality of deserving judgment before a perfectly just and holy creator. You have breached the covenant, and therefore you are liable to the penalties of that breach.
But if it just stopped at guilt, it would essentially just be a legal problem. Like a judge could just wave a gavel and dismiss the charges.
Right, which is where a lot of theology stops.
And this is where modern psychology often struggles, right? We have secular frameworks to deal with feelings of guilt, but we treat them purely as internal neuroses.
Yes.
But Velasquez is saying, no, the guilt is an objective reality in the universe.
Yeah.
But then he layers on the second aspect, which makes it worse: pollution.
Pollution is the inward ontological corruption that defiles human nature.
Okay, define that.
It means that the act of rebellion didn't just break a rule, it introduced a systemic rot into the human source code. Your desires, your rationality, your affections, they are all completely tainted by this drive for autonomy.
Oh, I see. It's like introducing a corrupted string of code into a software's root directory. It's not just that the program crashed once because of a user error. It's that a bug was permanently written into the kernel, so every single subsequent operation the computer runs is executed with a fatal flaw.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. And that corrupted code inevitably produces the third aspect: bondage.
Bonded.
The essays draw heavily on Romans chapter 1 to explain this part. The illusion of the fall was that by rejecting God, humanity would become free, neutral agents.
We can do whatever we want.
Right. But the reality is that human beings are designed to worship. If we do not worship the Creator, we will inevitably worship the creation.
We just swap out the object of our worship. We worship success or romantic relationships or political ideologies or, our own self-image.
Exactly. And whatever you worship, you eventually serve. Bondage is the enslaving power of these disordered desires. Sin becomes a literal master.
You lose control.
You are no longer free to simply choose the good. Your will is held captive by the very autonomy you seized.
Which naturally culminates in the fourth aspect, alienation. That four-dimensional rupture we just discussed. We are estranged from God, ourselves, each other, and the world.
So, to summarize the actual human condition according to Velasquez, we are legally guilty, ontologically polluted, volitionally enslaved, and relationally alienated.
We are the fish gasping on the dock.
Yes, gasping on the dock.
This presents a massive philosophical and theological puzzle, though. And it's one that listeners who study theology often get hung up on.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, so the framework asserts we are separated from God. But Orthodox theology also asserts that God is omnipresent. He is everywhere, at all times, actively sustaining the existence of every single atom in the universe.
Right.
If he is holding the molecules of my body together right now, how is it logically possible for me to be separated from him. Geometrically, it makes no sense.
This is a crucial paradox. And Velazquez dedicates a significant portion of his essays to detailing what he calls the mechanics of distance.
The mechanics of distance.
Yeah. The key is differentiating between spatial distance and moral or covenantal distance.
Break down the physics of that for us.
Sure. So the texts point to Psalm 139 and Colossians 1, which firmly affirm that God is intimately present everywhere, upholding all things by the word of his power.
Right. You can't flee from his presence.
Exactly. Therefore, separation from God cannot mean total metaphysical absence. If God completely withdrew his presence from the universe wouldn't just be a dark, sad place.
It would vanish.
It would instantly cease to exist. It would vanish into nothingness.
So it's not that God packed his bags, abandoned the Milky Way, and relocated to a different dimension.
Not at all. God has not moved spatially. Humanity has moved covenantally. The distance is a moral rupture and a judicial exclusion.
Okay.
God's presence remains absolutely everywhere. However, and this is the terrifying mechanism Velazquez explores for the polluted, alienated human being, that exact same divine presence changes its function. It ceases to be life-giving and becomes profoundly threatening.
There is an analogy in the source text that I think illuminates this perfectly. Velazquez writes, "The same sun that melts wax hardens clay."
Yes, the sun analogy.
Let's examine the physics of that for a second. The sun does not alter its nature at all. It radiates heat and light consistently. But the effect of that solar radiation depends entirely, 100%, on the molecular composition of the object it is hitting.
That is the precise mechanism of God's holiness in this framework. The modern listener very often equates holiness with God just being, exceptionally nice.
Or morally pure, in a really passive, quiet way.
Right. But Velazquez defines holiness as the radiant, consuming, aggressive purity of God's character. It is an active energy. God is not morally flexible. He cannot lower his standards to accommodate pollution.
So to a purified, covenantally aligned creature, the radiant heat of God's holiness is experienced as absolute joy, warmth, and life.
Exactly.
But to a polluted, rebellious creature, the clay, that exact same radiant heat, is experienced as wrath, terror, and hardening.
And the framework uses the prophet Isaiah to illustrate this reaction in real time. In Isaiah chapter 6, the prophet receives a vision of God seated on a throne, with the angels declaring his holiness.
Right.
What is Isaiah's psychological and physiological response to that nearness?
Well, he doesn't pull out a journal and write a nice poem. He doesn't feel a warm, sentimental glow. He basically experiences a massive panic attack.
He cries out, "Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips." The moment the absolute, unshielded purity of God's holiness encounters human pollution, it instantly exposes and condemns it.
The analogy it uses, like a moth flying into a blast furnace.
Oh, that's intense.
Well, think about it. The moth isn't incinerated because the fire has a personal vendetta against it. The fire isn't evil. The moth is destroyed because the fire is perfectly intensely hot and the moth is highly combustible.
Yes.
Human pollution is inherently combustible in the presence of absolute holiness.
That specific dynamic is why the entire Old Testament sacrificial system had to be instituted in the first place.
Oh, right. The tabernacle.
Yeah, Velazquez's infographics map out the architecture of the tabernacle, and it's fascinating. The tabernacle wasn't just a place to sing songs, it was a highly regulated containment unit for the presence of God.
Explain how the architecture actually reflects this separation.
So you had the outer courts, then the holy place, and then at the very center, the Holy of Holies, where the concentrated presence of God dwelled.
The blast furnace.
Right. But separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the structure was a massive, incredibly thick veil.
It was a literal, physical, woven barrier.
Yes. The architectural message was unmistakable. Holy God dwells in the midst of a polluted people, but direct access is lethal. Access must be restricted, it must be heavily mediated by a high priest, and it is incredibly costly.
It requires blood.
It requires atonement to shield the combustible human from the blast furnace of God's purity. The veil dramatized every single day that covenantal separation is a harsh, objective reality.
And what's truly tragic is that this restricted access, this profound alienation, didn't just remain contained within the tent in the ancient Middle East. Velazquez maps out how this fundamental dislocation infected the entirety of human history, psychology, and even our religious systems.
It spreads everywhere.
The timeline moves into an era he categorizes as the long exile.
To understand the psychological weight of this era, the essays point to a pretty brutal diagnosis in the New Testament.
In Ephesians, right?
Yeah, Ephesians chapter 2. The Apostle Paul is describing the baseline state of humanity apart from intervention. He says people are alienated from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world.
Without God in the world. If you actually sit with that phrase for a minute, it is chilling.
It really is.
It is the ultimate definition of the void. Without the source of life, without a covenantal tether, without any structural hope, you were just drifting in a completely hostile universe.
But here is where the listener really needs to pay close attention, because Velazquez highlights a massive misconception we have about this.
Okay, lay it on us.
The prophets, figures like Isaiah, Amos, and Jeremiah, they make it abundantly clear that this profound separation does not always manifest as atheism.
Wait, expand on that. Because we assume that if you are separated from God, you are essentially a secular materialist who just denies the divine entirely.
That is the logical assumption, yes. But human beings are meaning-making creatures. We are hardwired for the water, remember?
Right.
So when we are out of the water, we try to simulate it. The framework analyzes a concept it calls religion without repentance.
Simulating the water. I like that. How does that look in practice, though?
Well, the prophets exposed a devastating irony in ancient Israel. The people were actually maintaining incredibly intense religious activity.
Oh, they were doing all the rituals.
They were offering the correct sacrifices. They were observing the feast days. Their choirs were singing the right psalms, and they were using all the correct pious vocabulary.
Yeah. So externally, they looked like they were in perfect covenantal alignment.
Completely. But internally, God says through the prophets, "These people draw near to me with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me."
Wow.
They were utilizing the external machinery of religion to manage God, to appease him, while maintaining their absolute practical autonomy. They wanted the benefits of the covenant without the surrender of the covenant.
So what does this all mean? They wanted to use the API call without installing the operating system.
Exactly.
And Velazquez explicitly lists this as a primary misunderstanding for modern listeners. We constantly conflate our emotional state with our objective covenantal reality.
The emotion versus reality matrix in his maps is crucial right here.
Let's break that down, because in our culture today, emotion is king. If I feel a certain way, it must be true.
Right.
So someone might attend a highly produced worship service, the lighting is perfect, the chord progression swells, they get chills, they cry, and they conclude, I am so close to God right now.
Yes.
Or, conversely, a faithful person goes through a brutal tragedy, clinical depression sets in, they feel absolute numbness, and they conclude, God has abandoned me.
The essays push back forcefully against this modern emotionalism. Separation, in this framework, is an objective, moral, and covenantal status. It is not a mood ring.
Not a mood ring. That's good.
You can experience a massive surge of transcendent emotion, literally a dopamine hit from a religious experience, while actively, stubbornly living in unrepentant rebellion against God. The emotion does not negate the pollution.
And on the flip side, you can feel entirely devoid of spiritual sensation while walking in grueling faithful obedience through a really dark night of the soul.
Exactly.
Your sensory perception of the water does not determine whether or not you are actually in the water.
This raises an important question about how our current society handles the concept of pollution or sin.
We domesticate it.
Yes.
We call it a mistake. We frame it as a lack of education or emotional immaturity or just, the messy byproduct of living your truth.
But Velazquez points back to Romans 1. Scripture treats this autonomy as a hostile, captive rebellion. Human beings actively suppress the truth about the Creator because acknowledging it would require surrender.
Right.
We willingly exchange the glory of the infinite God for finite, manageable idols. And the terrifying part of Romans 1 is the nature of God's judgment.
Yes, the judgment isn't necessarily lightning bolts from the sky.
No. The text says 3 times, God gave them up. The ultimate judgment on human rebellion is God simply granting humanity its request.
You want it. You got it.
Exactly. You want autonomy. You want to define reality on your own terms. Thy will be done. God steps back and hands humanity over to the devastating, cascading consequences of its own disordered desires.
It is entirely self-reinforcing. We demand to build our own kingdom, and we end up basically constructing our own exile.
Yes.
And Velazquez's timeline shows how the history of the nation of Israel functions as a macro-level historical demonstration of this exact cycle.
The visual timeline traces the pattern really clearly. You have the initial fall in Eden. Then God pursues the separated humanity through the covenants, Abraham, Moses, David.
Right.
He orchestrates the Exodus, pulling Israel out of slavery in Egypt.
And the sources note that the Exodus wasn't just some political liberation campaign. They were liberated specifically for worship.
To re-enter the covenantal operating system.
Yes, they are brought to Sinai, given the law, and eventually established in the Promised Land. But despite all of this, the internal pollution remains completely untouched.
The heart is still corrupt.
So what happens? The kingdom fractures, idolatry takes over, and it culminates in the Babylonian exile.
Villesses uses a phrase here that I found incredibly profound. Every exile echoes Eden.
Oh, that's heavy.
It's a fractal pattern. When the nation of Israel is conquered and violently expelled from the Promised Land, weeping by the rivers of Babylon, it is a national historical replay of Adam and Eve being driven out of the garden.
It is the public geopolitical manifestation of spiritual separation.
Exactly. It provides empirical proof that sin, by its very nature, expels. It fractures the land, it destroys the temple, and it shatters the identity of the people.
But the framework notes that the prophets didn't view the Babylonian exile merely as punitive destruction. They viewed it as a brutal, necessary pedagogy.
It was a school.
Yeah.
It was the harsh classroom where Israel had to learn, through agonizing experience, that life manufactured outside the parameters of God's covenant is ultimately death.
But even in the deepest, darkest moments of that exile, the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel introduce a radical new data point.
The promise of a new covenant.
Right. And crucially, this promise isn't just about moving people back to Jerusalem geographically, because geography can't fix pollution.
No, it can't.
Ezekiel talks about a fundamental surgical procedure on human nature, removing the heart of stone and replacing it with a heart of flesh.
An internal upgrade to the operating system, which forces us to ask the ultimate question of the framework. If humanity is trapped in this self-reinforcing cycle of exile,
If we are locked out of the garden, separated by a thick veil of holiness, and completely incapable of curing our own internal pollution,
how does the mechanism of reconciliation actually work?
here's where it gets really interesting. This is the pivot point of human history, according to the sources.
Yeah.
Enter the Messiah.
Yes.
This is where Velocist's theology gets intensely mechanical and, frankly, just beautiful.
The framework presents Jesus Christ not as a moral philosopher offering advice on how to be a better person, but as the definitive end of separation.
He is the climax of the grand narrative.
The infographics label him as the true Israel, the obedient son, the second Adam, and the ultimate temple.
Let's look at the mechanics of the incarnation first, because the sheer physics of it directly addresses the mechanics of distance we talked about earlier.
Right.
The infinite holy God takes on finite human biology. He voluntarily enters the polluted atmosphere.
The movement of the incarnation is entirely centrifugal. It moves outward toward the marginalized and separated. The essays trace how Jesus physically interacted with the world.
He didn't isolate himself?
No, he didn't isolate himself in a sterile religious bubble. He deliberately moved toward the outcast, the ceremonially unclean, the diseased, and the morally disgraced.
He touches the leper, which under the law would make a normal person unclean. But because of his inherent holiness, his purity acts as a purifying agent, not a destructive one.
Yes.
He eats with corrupt tax collectors. He is the physical, historical embodiment of the Creator walking out into the toxic wasteland of the dock to find the suffocating fish.
But the framework insists that simply teaching and healing was insufficient to cure the root problem.
It wasn't enough.
The trajectory of the incarnation leads inevitably and necessarily to the absolute horror of the crucifixion.
And this is where we have to go deep, because the cultural understanding of the cross is often highly sentimentalized. Jesus died because he loves us.
True, but
True.
Yeah.
But how does a Roman execution 2,000 years ago solve the four-dimensional rupture of Genesis 3? Velocist focuses on a very specific, agonizing moment during the crucifixion to explain the mechanics of atonement.
he focuses on Matthew 27.46. Jesus, hanging on the cross in the darkness, cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
The cry of dereliction.
The essays call this the cry of dereliction.
Let's pause and analyze the sheer ontological weight of that cry.
Velazquez argues this cannot be minimized as Jesus merely quoting a psalm because he felt sad or physically in pain. This is the precise mechanism of reconciliation occurring in real time.
Wow.
This is the moment the judicial weight of human separation is transferred.
The legal guilt and the ontological pollution we discussed earlier, it is being literally downloaded onto him.
Exactly. To use the framework's terminology, the Son of God, who has existed for all eternity in a state of perfect, unbroken, joyful communion with the Father within the Trinity, he willingly steps into the exact center of the human exile.
He acts as his ultimate circuit breaker.
He absorbs the full, unmitigated heat of God's radiant holiness directed against human pollution without any shield.
He steps in front of the blast furnace. He experiences the objective reality of being without God in the world.
Yeah.
He suffers the ultimate infinite isolation of the exile so that the rebels don't have to.
He becomes the fish on the dock, suffocating in the toxic atmosphere of human rebellion so that humanity can be placed back into the life-giving water of the covenant.
And the immediate physical result of this transaction, the sources point right back to the architecture of the tabernacle we discussed.
This is amazing.
What is recorded as happening the exact moment Jesus yields up his spirit. The massive woven veil in the Jewish temple, the physical barrier of restricted access, is violently torn in two from top to bottom.
The physics of the atonement result in an architectural tear. The veil was not torn from bottom to top, as if humanity finally achieved enough moral progress to break through.
No.
It was torn from top to bottom by the hand of the Creator. It is the definitive cosmic sign of open access.
The blast furnace has been satisfied. The containment unit is completely dismantled. Ephesians 2 describes this perfectly. He himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility.
The legal guilt has been paid.
The pollution has been expiated. The way into the unhindered presence of God is thrown wide open.
So the barrier is broken. The penalty of the exile is exhausted. The crucial pivot the framework makes in its final section is application.
Okay, let's get into the practicals.
Because how does an individual actually walk through that torn veil today? How do we take this massive cosmic Trinitarian theology and map it onto the gritty reality of a Tuesday morning commute?
This is where Velazquez's essays get incredibly invasive, in a good way.
Yeah.
Because if it's true that we are no longer fundamentally separated, if we have been brought near through the mechanism of Christ's sacrifice, that ontological reality has to alter our daily functionality.
Absolutely.
The first major implication the framework addresses is personal holiness.
And here the texts offer a vital clarification to prevent catastrophic misunderstanding. There is a massive temptation to hear about radical grace and conclude that sin just no longer matters.
Right. If the veil is torn, who cares how I live?
The old grace is a permission slip to sin argument.
But Velazquez argues that this betrays a total misunderstanding of the cross. The cross doesn't prove that sin is a minor issue that God easily overlooks.
Far from it.
The cross proves that sin is an infinitely deadly, universe-fracturing force. It literally cost the life of the incarnate Son of God to neutralize it.
So, holiness is not a mechanism for earning God's nearness. The contract is over. You cannot earn the nearness. Christ's atonement secured it unconditionally for the believer.
Right.
Holiness, then, is about living in accordance with your new environment. If you have been rescued from the suffocating dock, your gills healed, and you've been placed back into the pristine, life-giving ocean, why on earth would you keep trying to crawl back onto the dock to eat dirt?
The essays pose deeply probing diagnostic questions for the reader here. What habits and practices are you engaging in that enhance your capacity to process the water?
And conversely, what compromises are you tolerating that are clogging your gills and dulling your spiritual sensitivity?
This ties directly into the mechanics of prayer. Velazquez describes prayer beautifully as the language of reconciled nearness.
I love that phrase.
Me too. But let's be honest. Most people have experienced the intense frustration of trying to pray, and it feels like you are talking to a brick wall. The signal drops. The heavens feel like brass.
The framework makes a careful distinction here. Not every season of spiritual dryness is the direct result of a specific hidden sin. Sometimes it is just the testing of faith.
Sure.
However, the sources assert that unconfessed sin creates massive interference in our communion with God.
It's a cryptographic key mismatch. God is broadcasting on the frequency of holy love, and your receiver is tuned to the frequency of autonomous rebellion. It creates static.
The prescribed mechanism to clear that static is confession. And confession, in this framework, isn't about groveling to appease an angry deity.
No, it's not.
It is about bringing the pollution out of the darkness and into the light. It is agreeing with God about the reality of your actions, which realigns your receiver to his frequency and restores the clarity of the connection.
Now, let's trace this outward, because this vertical realignment inevitably alters the horizontal plane. How does this theology impact human relationships?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is perhaps one of the most profound insights in the practical implications section. Velasquez argues that every single human conflict is a downstream consequence of our original vertical rupture with God.
Every conflict.
Yes, whether it is a bitter, screaming match in a marriage, toxic backstabbing in a corporate office, intense sibling rivalry, or massive geopolitical polarization, all of it traces back to the me versus you dynamic inaugurated in Genesis 3.
Wow.
When a human being is alienated from their creator, they lose their secure anchor of identity, they become starved for validation, control, and security, and they inevitably try to extract those things from other human beings.
And when other finite humans fail to provide infinite security, we attack them.
Exactly.
So according to this framework, the cure for a broken marriage or a toxic workplace culture isn't just behavioral modification. Velasquez calls that sentimental niceness.
Sentimental niceness won't cut it.
No, the actual cure is shared submission to the reality of the torn veil.
It requires two alienated exiles realizing that they have both been forgiven an infinite, unpayable debt by the Creator. Only that realization provides the supernatural resources required for genuine patience, truthfulness, and mercy.
I see how this scales up to leadership as well. The essays spend time analyzing the dynamics of authority. Whether you are a CEO, a pastor, a community organizer, or a parent, if you, as the leader, are spiritually distant from God, you will inevitably project the anxiety of that distance onto the people you are leading.
A leader cannot shepherd a community toward a nearness they are not personally experiencing.
That's a great point.
If a leader is functionally operating out on the dock, gasping for air, their leadership style will default to the mechanisms of Genesis 3. They will lead with obsessive control instead of reverent trust.
Yeah.
They will manage superficial behaviors instead of shepherding actual hearts. They will view their followers as tools to secure their own validation rather than souls to be served.
That is a devastatingly accurate diagnosis of so much toxic leadership today. I want to pivot, though, and highlight a deeply pastoral application Velasquez makes here.
Okay.
There is likely someone listening to this right now who is in the middle of a brutal, disorienting season of suffering. Maybe you are engulfed by shame regarding a past failure. Maybe you are looking at the wreckage of your life and you feel completely, utterly abandoned by God.
The framework provides a vital, objective anchor for that exact experience. It insists that we must distinguish between the feeling of being abandoned and the objective reality of being abandoned.
Because of the cry of dereliction.
Precisely. Because Jesus Christ absorbed the ultimate, objective, judicial forsakenness on the cross, your seasons of intense emotional darkness do not mean that God has withdrawn his covenantal presence from you.
That's huge.
If you are tethered to Christ, the verdict of forsakenness has already been served on him, and it has been overturned by the resurrection.
Therefore, double jeopardy does not apply. God will not forsake you for the sins that Christ was already forsaken for. That means, for the repentant person, shame does not get the final word in your biography. Grace does.
Amen to that.
You might feel like you are wandering blindly in the dark, but this theology insists that you are tethered with an unbreakable chain to the one who conquered the darkness.
And this brings us to the final horizon of the grand narrative. We've traced the line from creation to the fall, through the cyclical exiles, to the definitive intervention of the cross.
But the timeline doesn't stop in the present day.
No, it doesn't.
The sources map out the final stages of human history: the church, the final judgment, and the new creation. Let's briefly examine the role of the church in this framework.
Okay.
Velasquez defines it not merely as a 501c3 nonprofit or a religious club, but as the reconciled community.
Yeah.
It is designed to be an outpost of the future reality in the present day.
An outpost.
It exists to embody something the secular world cannot manufacture through sheer willpower. A fellowship where former enemies, divided by race, class, or history, become spiritual siblings.
Yeah.
Every single act of genuine forgiveness inside a local church is a defiant, public declaration to the universe that the alienation of Genesis 3 does not have the final word.
However, the sources do not shy away from the sobering reality of the final judgment.
Right. They explicitly warn against the modern tendency to ignore or sanitize this doctrine.
The final judgment is presented not as a sudden, arbitrary fit of divine rage, but as the permanent judicial ratification of human choices.
It's the final crystallization of the trajectories we are already on.
Yes. For those who persistently, stubbornly insist on autonomy, who reject the torn veil and refuse the rescue mission of Christ, that chosen distance will eventually become permanent.
Sobering.
The framework describes hell as the final, absolute form of chosen distance, judicially confirmed and eternally sealed. It is the tragic, horrifying reality that God, in the end, honors the rebels' absolute demand to be left alone.
But for those who surrender their autonomy and receive the grace of the torn veil, the timeline terminates in a reality that is almost difficult to comprehend: the new creation.
It's beautiful.
The imagery Velazquez pulls from Revelation 21 and 22 is breathtaking. It represents the ultimate cosmic reversal of the Edenic exile.
The capstone verse is Revelation 21.3. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. This is the total, final eradication of separation. The visual maps depict this beautifully.
Everything is restored.
There is no more curse, no more decay, no more relational fracturing, and most importantly, there is no more temple in the old restricted architectural sense.
Because the entire cosmos becomes the Holy of Holies. You don't need a localized containment unit to mediate the presence of God when the absolute purity of the Lord God Almighty is permanently, safely walking among his healed people.
The environmental dimension is completely restored. The river of life and the tree of life reappear. The long exile is decisively over.
Access is complete.
The covenantal communion is permanent and unassailable. The texts describe this eternal state not just as surviving indefinitely in a pleasant location, but as an endless plunge into unbroken, dynamic fellowship. As Velazquez writes, worship becomes sight, and faith becomes fullness.
The human operating system, which has been crashing and rebooting in a state of corrupted restlessness since Genesis 3, is finally permanently stabilized in the environment it was always meant for.
It's the perfect fix.
The entire grand narrative of Scripture, from the first page to the last, is the staggering story of the Creator moving heaven and earth, absorbing the penalty of our rebellion to dwell with his people again.
It completely reframes how we view every struggle, every longing, and every relationship in the present moment.
The sources make it clear. Every human conflict you engage in, every pang of that suffocating loneliness you feel, even when you are surrounded by 100 people, is a surviving echo of our collective exile from Eden.
We are all exiles.
We are a planet of displaced people, desperately trying to find our way back to the garden. So I want to leave you, the listener, with a highly practical thought to mull over as you navigate your life this week.
Yeah, let's hear it.
If the people who wrong you, the people who annoy you at work, the family members who deeply hurt you, are fundamentally just fellow exiles, people stumbling in the dark, reacting out of a profound homesickness for a God they don't fully understand, and a peace they can't manufacture, how does that change the mechanical way you offer forgiveness tomorrow morning?
It demands a total paradigm shift. It moves you from a posture of superiority to a posture of deep shared solidarity. You realize their toxic behavior is a symptom of the exact same systemic dislocation that you yourself had to be rescued from.
The God who was separated from us didn't just stand safely on the balcony of heaven, shouting down instructions, demanding we figure out the maze to earn our way back to him.
He came to us.
He plunged into the wasteland. He took on our fragile biology, absorbed the infinite weight of our judgment, and walked into the absolute darkest depths of the human experience simply to walk us home. Think about your own position in that story this week. Are you still trying to manufacture your own water? Stop settling for the dirt of the dog and dive fully back into the grace you were engineered for.